This is my last night of presenting this programme. Given the flow of news events, I can tell you it feels like at least a decade since those days before the 2015 election. So as we ponder on the end of austerity and the beginning of Brexit, we thought this might be a good night to look at the journey the country has been on, how we got here and where we go. We'll be joined by the former Chancellor George Osborne and others to discuss this in a moment. But this has been a period that's challenged a lot of things we took for granted. One kept thinking normal service will be resumed shortly, only to find it hasn't been. But take a look behind it all. And the first surprise is this. Despite slow growth and austerity, economics hasn't been the centre of attention at all. Instead, it's the new politics, the rise of the SNP, UKIP, Jeremy Corbyn, identity politics, #MeToo, the trans movement, vitriolic debate on social media, and of course, the Brexit argument. They've been the things we've all been talking about. But for one brought up to think the economy drives everything, this is like a glitch in the space-time continuum. Is there a way of explaining it? Well, I'll have a try. For years, the prevailing ideology was, it's the economy, stupid. A quarter point here or there on interest rates, keeping GDP growth up and inflation down. To that end, it made sense to let China take our industry and produce our cheap goods. Hey, that boosts the spending power of many in Britain. But it wasn't perfect. What with the crash and all and stagnant incomes for many.
Young people have really, in terms of income, housing, affordability, education...
They've been screwed, basically.
They have been screwed.
Yeah. And in a parallel, non-economic world, the bugs were becoming clear. A fragmented gig economy, particularly affecting the young. The towns and small cities that suddenly seemed to lack economic purpose. Economists had failed to compute how a hyper-individualistic global economy affects people's feelings about the system. What actually seems to matter to people are belonging, community, groups, respect. We appear to have been craving those.
You know, it's supposed to be multicultural. We are basically on paper, but in theory we're not, you know. All the communities are separate.
For some, especially in towns of England, that's about nation, nationalism, defending the order, fighting external threats. How many of you think immigration has gone too far? For others, especially students and liberal professionals in big cities, it's identity politics, gender, transgender, colour, sexuality.
People are not so invested in the old identity politics of the 80s and 90s.
Or the labels of gay and lesbian and sort of they're separate and then there's...
Yeah.
But for all, it's a fight for tribe and status. Those are the commodities that economists forgot. And when towns and small cities voted for Brexit, maybe they believed economists' warnings.
We're out.
They just wanted more of a sense of belonging to something.
A vote to leave will push our economy into a recession.
How many of you trust the Treasury to give us the best figures at their disposal, the right kind of data on this? Hands up. OK. Maybe Project Fear made people feel they were being belittled, not respected. Maybe the problem exposed by the referendum was that the high priests of the prevailing ideology in government, media and academia hadn't understood where things were going wrong. Maybe it's not the economy, stupid. Well, clearly someone put something in the water and the country has changed in recent years. But what lies behind that? Austerity, economics, or something else? We'll hear from a cross-the-spectrum panel in a few minutes. But first, few people have been more influential in politics in the last decade than former Chancellor George Osborne, the man forever associated with austerity as the means of getting the deficit down in 2010. And if we believe the Prime Minister now, the man whose era of austerity is coming to an end. Very good evening to you.
Good to be here.
It does seem like the government is saying it went too far and they need to push back a bit, pull it back.
Well, I see it as a perfectly natural end point to a repair job of the public finances. You know, the public finances are in much better state now in 2018 than they were when I walked into the Treasury in 2010, when we were borrowing so much. And we, of course, at the time had a hung parliament, had to put together a coalition. So other countries in Europe were on the brink of a fiscal crisis. So, it's a different period in our politics, and my successor, Philip Hammond, makes a different set of judgments.
So do you think at any point it went too far? You don't think you overshot?
I don't think we had much choice but to deal with a very serious and threatening situation the British economy faced. I think what's true, if you were trying to look at the big picture, I don't think a historian would have a huge amount of trouble looking back at this period of history and spotting some of the big trends that we lose in the kind of day-to-day political fight. First of all, there was an enormous economic shock. Second, only to the Great Depression. Second, there was an enormous change in our technology and the way politics was done. I don't think I spotted that as a political participant at the time.
You mean social media and
but
stuff like that?
It was the same disruption that I'm now a newspaper editor at the Evening Standard, but it's the same disruption that's happened to newspapers or music or, buying things online. It disrupted politics, and the mainstream political forces were wrong-footed by that.
I mean, it's interesting, though, because there were some political choices that were not inevitable. And I wonder whether you think these went too far in the end. So the universal credit cuts. You went into the 2015 election saying we're going to cut 12 billion from welfare. You've never managed to do that. And every time it's approached in the end, as in yesterday, they've had to reverse the planned cuts that you'd penciled in earlier. Did that go too far? Do you regret that?
I took the judgment, and obviously I'm not in politics anymore, that if you were going to have to deal with the fact the country was spending too much, it would be a bit odd to leave out the very large chunk the government was spending on welfare.
Yeah, but you gave 10 billion in tax cuts to corporates, to corporations. You budget after budget.
The second part of the plan, and let me remind you, we did deliver the strongest recovery from that recession of any of the major economies in the West, and created jobs at a time when people thought there was going to be mass unemployment. But one of the ways we did that was to make the country more attractive for investment. We can have this debate about how Britain goes forward, but unless Britain earns its way in the world, attracts investment into Britain, these fundamental rules have not changed. You're not going to be able to afford your health service or your education system going forward.
So here's the interesting thing.
Things like having an uncompetitive business tax rate just mean that corporates in China or America or wherever else in the world take a decision, they're not going to come to you.
You see, you're not regretting anything at the moment.
No.
Okay, give us one you're regretting.
I think we did get things wrong. I think, as I say, well, first of all, we didn't spot the shift in politics. There are things we could have done, I think, to fix the banking system more quickly than we did. I think we were wrong to play into the debate that everything that Brussels did was a challenge and a battle and was wrong. We were too late in the day trying to explain some of the benefits of European Union membership. On immigration, we were promising targets that we couldn't deliver, and that then led to a debate about how you might deliver those targets. Not that I see any evidence that they're going to be delivered in the future, but we definitely contributed to that argument, didn't make enough of the value of immigration. Okay. So I'm happy to look at mistakes we made, but
that is a big
but overall, faced with a gigantic financial crash and a set of difficult decisions in a hung parliament, I think David Cameron, myself, Nick Clegg and others worked hard in what we felt to be the national interest to put things right in as fair a way as possible. And ultimately the country, grew, jobs were created, and we avoided the kind of calamitous situation that quite a lot of European countries found themselves in during this period.
You say, on the immigration one specifically, it was a mistake to have the unachievable target.
Because it opened up the door in the referendum to the question. It essentially allowed in the referendum a minority of people who were interested in, rather esoteric issues of sort of constitutional sovereignty, and had never really been able to get traction with the majority of the population.
Agree with you that was a mistake?
Well, you have to get David Cameron on the show, but it's your last show, so I'm not sure you're about that. But we allowed that kind of, I think, minority concern, because we pool sovereignty in all sorts of organisations like NATO, to be linked to immigration control, and that was pretty lethal in that referendum debate. But I think you've got to remember that just before that referendum, which obviously was went catastrophically wrong for those of us who were arguing for Remain, the Conservative Party had won re-election in precisely those towns which you're talking about, the Nuneatons of this world, the towns in Cheshire, like the one that I used to represent.
No, but look, here's the thing. I want to push
so the
it on.
country had not turned against the Conservative solutions on the economy at that point.
I do want to push on it, because a lot of people, a lot of Remainers who see you as a kind of an ally because you're a Remainer, they really think it was austerity that basically delivered Brexit. And you don't like Brexit, they don't like Brexit. And a lot of people think it was you who, in the end, were to blame.
I mean, obviously, you know, I'm going to have my own views and people have their own views. I would just make two observations. First of all, one I've already said, which is we'd just won an election on that programme.
Yeah.
Second, if you look at actually who voted for Brexit, there were the economically insecure, the very people on low incomes in some of those industrial towns that felt left behind. But of course, a big block of Brexit supporters were the retired. And one of the charges laid against the government I was part of was that we protected the retired, the pensioners, from austerity. In fact, it was that kind of curious alliance, which I don't think you'll ever see again in British politics, of the insecure, the low-income people looking for work or in uncertain work, and the insulated, i.e. the people who had retired and were not really exposed to some of the economic consequences of
beat that.
And you know, those people were not what you would traditionally seen as the sort of principal, people on the receiving end of austerity.
Can I ask you this? Do you think it was good that the Conservative Party won the 2015 election?
Well, yes, because I was campaigning very hard to do that.
You look back on it and you think that's worked for Britain?
Well, look, the choice ultimately was one that the British people had in the referendum.
But you don't like the choice. I mean,
I don't like the choice, and I argued a different...
You didn't want the referendum.
Well, I was at the time...
Just stop and think about it, because, I mean...
Well, I don't think,
you're obviously, tribally, you're a Tory, but I just wonder whether, when you look back, you could honestly believe...
It's definitely a good thing that the Conservatives won the election, and it's a shame that, in my view, that the Remain campaign lost the referendum.
You would have preferred a coalition in that. I think you would have preferred a coalition outcome, though, wouldn't you? Not the majority.
No. Look, I fought very hard for a Conservative majority. Look, the Conservatism I think works is socially progressive and fiscally conservative, right? And we lost in the election I wasn't involved in 2017 because we tried to out UKIP. We ain't going to win the next election by trying to out Corbyn. You know, Conservatives should stand their ground for what I think still millions of people are, which is they want a progressive, successful country, but they understand you've got to live within your means, you've got to be pro-business. And, you know, trying to kind of bang the nationalist drum doesn't actually work for modern conservatism. And trying to just, outspend our political opponents is not going to help the Conservatives either.
There is a sort of story of the last decade that says the country had really grown weary, not just of austerity, it was something just about the whole economic model. They'd never felt it was really working for them. The gig economy, corporations who just pursue shareholder value and kind of don't care about the workers. There was just a real weariness, and I wonder whether you missed that, whether we all missed it.
I think I was grasping towards it, I think, when we introduced the national living wage. But I think it is true to say that an economy, this is all quite 19th century Marxist, but an economy where the returns to capital are much greater than the returns to labour is one where support for a capitalist economy is going to decline. And we were in a situation, partly because of the financial crash, partly because of the decisions taken around the world to try and get us out of that potential depression, where people who had capital saw big returns, whereas people who were in jobs saw flat wages, not just in this country, but in every major economy around the world. Now, there are things you can do as a government to intervene to support that, like increasing your minimum wage, like spreading capital by making your pension entitlements more generous, by, for example, helping people own homes, by tackling...
So you got there in the end.
But I'm not sure we put it all together, as coherently as perhaps we could have done. But I think that is, certainly if you're a centre-right politician, or indeed a centre-right newspaper, you want to be moving into that space. How do you spread the gains in a business-friendly economy? And, there's definitely, that's where the kind of creative policy making needs to take place.
Let's look at, we are where we are. So very briefly, Is this a sort of normal? Is this normal Britain, or is this a kind of nervous breakdown? Is it a short-term thing where we're angry, divided, we're confused about where we're going, we feel to be in a very strange time? Or do you think this is, we get used to this for 20 years?
The short answer is that we don't know. I mean, you would think that politics would adjust to the shifts in technology, the economic crash, and mainstream forces would re-emerge, because I still believe that's where millions of people want to vote. People don't want a choice between Jeremy Corbyn and Jacob Rees-Mogg. You know, most people want something in the middle. So I think politics will readjust, but you can't be for sure. And of course, you know, critical in all this, the decision to leave the EU is a one-way door. So that is not a temporary thing. If we walk through that door, there will not really be any going back.
The language and bitterness of politics has really taken off, hasn't it? Do you feel that has contributed to a sort of poisoning of social discourse?
I think that is driven partly by the technology. I mean, I see it now as a newspaper editor, you know, that the drive to kind of get your headlines, get your stories up there, you know, pushes you towards more extreme interpretations of the story than the story makes legitimate.
Clickbait,
and I think you have to, you know, as an editor, whether it's, you know, on Newsnight or in a newspaper, kind of pull back and say that is not actually what the story is telling us. And you know, responsible journalism on the left or the right, or you know, or the BBC needs to spot when they're being sensationalist just because they're pursuing the clicks on the website.
I think I bet that the biggest regret I can get out of you this evening, I mean, you have given some, is the comment that was attributed to you. You didn't say it in public about you won't be happy till Theresa May is chopped up in bags in your freezer, because that was one of those sort of examples of something that now we just think, oh, that's not the right way to sort of talk about politics. You must regret that one.
Well, look, I certainly have said things in private which, you know, I probably shouldn't have, and actually apologised for it. But I worked very hard all my life to make the Conservative Party electable, and it is painful to me to see it losing support in large areas of the country where it shouldn't be losing that support, particularly against actually a Labour opposition which I don't think is in a fit state at the moment. So, you know, do I care strongly about these issues? I still do, even though I'm not in politics anymore.
You were a close colleague of David Cameron. You've admitted he made lots of mistakes on immigration and on holding a referendum. In your view, in your view, you were counselled against those.
That is.
How do you think he will be remembered as a Prime Minister?
Well, I think he took over the country, became the Prime Minister in a very, very difficult and dangerous situation, where the economy was in a dire situation and the political system was paralysed. And he put together Britain's great coalition, first effective coalition in peacetime. And, you know, look at the problems the government are having at the moment with no majority. You know, he gave the government a majority. And we did a whole series of reforms, not just economic reforms, but reforms to things like gay marriage, making that legal, that I think will stand the test of time as some of the great progressive acts that any government has undertaken. So, you know, I think, anyway, you'll have to wait for his delayed memoirs to get his version of things.
I want to bring the panel in now. We're joined by Polly Toynbee of The Guardian, Ash Sarkar, senior editor at Novara Media. Ash is a proper lefty. Suzanne Evans, former UKIP deputy chair, who represents, if you like, that strand of politics. George, one of the curious things is, if I had to pick who you're closest to in politics, Polly Toynbee and you, for all the enmity that has occurred between you over the years, I would guess you're actually now closer to Polly Toynbee's politics than you are to 2/3 of Conservative Party members. Isn't that true?
I think Polly is looking more shocked than I am.
It's utterly unthinkable that you should say such a thing. This man has done such harm and damage to this country. He has been the most right-wing Chancellor we have ever had. Well, if you look at yesterday's budget, if you look at the cuts that are still to come, to say nothing of what he's done before, even if you accept his economic arguments, which I don't, because he made the recession deeper by such extreme austerity, if you look at how he tipped his cuts, at the billions that he's taken from the poorest in benefits, and then abused them with that endless talk about people with their blinds down, trying to make people hate anyone on benefits, despite the fact that the great majority of them, as you well know, are in work, often working at 2 jobs. If they had blinds down, it's probably because they've been working all night. your treatment of the poorest people in this country has been despicable, and I would want to be in no way associated, and nor do I think your idea that
I don't think so. I think we can take
Polly
from that
doesn't accept the theory. Okay,
no, the idea that he's a centrist. I mean, you can talk about gay marriage. You'd never have done gay marriage if Labour hadn't already done civil partnerships. I mean, if that's all you can find that you did that was progressive.
I'll give you a quick right of reply, and then I'll get some comments from the rest of the panel.
I just disagree with all that. You know, we were left to desperate political and economic situation by the Labour government that she supported, and cleaned up the mess, but, you know, obviously not to your satisfaction.
I don't know to say one thing. I do like it that your newspaper now runs campaigns for poor London children. Please donate money to the Evening Standard's campaign for poor children, which is of a hypocrisy beyond anything you would think even he
By the
was
way, I think this is
capable
the sort of extreme language that you were just citing as one of the
No,
things
I
that have
wasn't using
contributed.
violence.
Before I
No
go to the
violence.
others, Polly, just before I go to the others, I do just want to get. But what effect do you think that? Is there a connection between that and the rise of identity politics on the left? The fact that we. And what is the connection?
I don't think it's true that, you know, that it's not about economics. I think it is. I think that if you have a mighty crash and then you have a long period of austerity, you have stagnant wages, I mean, wages that have fallen in a way that has never happened since the Napoleonic era.
But why does that make
people... If you pile onto that more and more, tightening the screw, people see around them public squalor, closure of public facilities.
Right. Suzanne, what's your account of what has happened over the last 4 years? Do you think we're in the midst of a nervous breakdown?
My goodness, where do we start? Well, I think in a sense it is a slight nervous breakdown, but it's only, I think, that because of the way in which Brexit's being handled. You know, for me, Brexit, yes, it wasn't about the economy. And I think the fact that George Osborne and the Remain team tried to sell us Project Fear, to say that the moment we voted leave, that we'd go into instant recession, that it would be the end of Britain as we knew it. That actually, most people by the end of campaign were laughing at that. And I spoke to so many people.
So you think it wasn't the economics that made them, they didn't think we're going to get richer?
Absolutely not. No, nobody...
Do you think we get poorer when we leave?
No,
a little bit poorer?
No,
but,
and nobody expected to get richer or poorer. We just expected to, as the Leave campaign famously said, take back control. And I think the problem that we're in this kind of identity crisis now as a nation is because the Brexit negotiations are being handled so badly. And I have to say, George, you know, for all you're talking about your ongoing support for the Conservative Party, I think if your newspaper was a little bit less anti-Brexit, then perhaps I might be able to give that a little bit more credibility.
I want to get a comment from Ash, because Ash, what's your theory of what's happened? Because it's not just, see, there's identity politics on the right, which is the kind of take back control nationalism. Well, but there's identity politics on the left.
Why do we talk about right? I mean, Polly said, you know, right at the beginning, you've been the most right-wing Chancellor ever, like it was an insult. You know, I hate this thing about the left is good, the right is bad.
I mean, I think if you invert an insult, that's more about how you heard the comment. I think that Polly made some very fair statements of facts. In terms of my analysis of
where we've got
to, is that I wonder what it is you mean by identity politics. When it comes down to what Halloween costume is someone wearing, frankly, I couldn't give a monkey's. What I care about is that the effects of austerity have been felt unevenly across different communities. So if it's a household headed by a person of colour, you are twice as likely to be amongst those hardest hit by austerity. In my view, that is a form of institutional racism.
But don't you feel we're in the middle of a kind of, it feels like we're in the middle of a culture war from Me Too and Black Lives Matter in the States. I mean, it's just, it feels like over the 4 years I've been at Newsnight, we've discussed that 10 times more than we've discussed public services, economics, interest rates.
The public services a little bit more. I personally don't think that there's a cultural aspect to saying that black people do not deserve to be shot down like animals in the street. For me, that's not a cultural issue. That's an issue about is our democracy, whether it's in the United States or here. I'm thinking in particular of Azara Rodney. I'm thinking of Mark Duggan. I'm thinking about the death of Smiley Culture. All these people that have died following police contact. For me, that's not a cultural issue. That's, are we treating our citizens equally when it comes to contact with the police? Clearly, that's not the case.
Suzanne?
I just think, you know, identity politics, the problem with it is you put forward the argument based on your single perspective. So you've talked about head of the households being black, being most poverty
people of colour. This is, I mean, this is a fact that you are
being poor.
Likely to be
I could equally talk about white working class boys underachieving in education. They're a group that now has been forgotten and left behind. And it's where do you end with this really? If you're constantly only arguing for one small minority of society, and that is the problem. I think we all need to take a step back, take a bigger picture view and talk about humanity as a whole and what is best for our country, and not break it down into these little groups.
No, but the difference is that you think that the minute I talk about households headed by people of colour, is that that's taking away something from this analysis of white working class boys.
No, you misunderstand me. I don't at all. I'm just pointing out that the flaw in the argument about always putting one minority first and trying to...
I'm not arguing that at all. I'm saying that things are unevenly distributed in terms of wealth.
I'd just like to get George in there. So
I was daring not into
No, but I'm really interested whether you think, because we didn't talk about identity
all I'd
politics,
say is,
it is actually a really big part of the public discourse at the moment.
Look, the country needs some shared agreement on how decisions are reached. 65 million people living on an island. You need to have some common consensus that there are elections, that the House of Commons is where decisions are made, that your media is going to at least give you the basic evidence or the facts of there are some basic things required to allow 65 million people to live together. And the danger is if you pull all of that apart, then you will undo the enormous progress this nation has made over 200 years to deliver much better living standards than exist in most places in the world.
You did that quite explosively, your party, by holding a referendum, which was the most decisive
Well, I seem to remember
thing.
every Labour MP voted for it, pretty much.
Well, I'm not a Labour MP. I think
Labour constituency voted for it.
You put it into the manifesto to deal with the extreme Brexiteers in your party. You then had to carry it out. I don't remember you resigning over it. You may not have been in favour of it. But to put that right in the middle of a time of this extreme austerity, the mixture was toxic. It has rent this country. Yes, indeed it was. Indeed it was.
That's why people voted.
That was their great mistake.
I don't think you can link. You can't directly link austerity to the referendum result, because it's generally agreed that older people were more likely to vote for Brexit, and it's generally accepted, and you would probably make this argument, that people like pensioners were better protected from austerity than others.
Well, there were different reasons.
It doesn't compute that the link.
We're missing a factor here. You're talking, Polly, as though Britain is an exceptional outlier in its populist insurrection. The truth is, Britain has not been terribly exceptional, despite George Osborne's presence, has it? This is something that has really just happened across Western country after Western country, now Brazil even. Ash, what's going on there?
Because I think what's really important about Brexit isn't just the stuff that we've discussed about nationalism, it's not just the stuff about austerity, it's about what it represented in terms of what I call a politics of discontinuity, so a rupture with what came before. And the problem with trying to argue the Remain case is, aside from arguing it a bit like a limp noodle, is that it's very difficult to present a case for the status quo when it's not benefiting a ton of people. So you look at what's happened in Brazil after 4 years of austerity. Don't forget that it was the centre-right parties after Dilma Rousseff was impeached that thought that they were going to eat up the vote share. It's those parties that collapsed. And it's, Bolsonaro who's been the ultimate victor of that.
I'm going to give Polly and George 20 seconds each. Do you think this country, over the next 10 years, finds itself a happy place again? Like 2012, Danny Boyle opening ceremony and all of that. 10 years, Polly?
Depends what happens next, doesn't it? But we are penciled in for another decade of very extreme austerity. I think that's a disaster. I think we have an electoral system that makes it impossible for people to express their particular views. They're stuck with two monolithic parties.
George,
that's been very destructive.
I just come back to the two big forces that affected all these countries: a big economic shock and a big change in technology. Both those things have disrupted history in the past, but history reasserts itself and mainstream forces come to the fore.
OK.